I speak about Australian and New Zealand poetry. Australia was on one continent for a long time. Only in the 14th century it was discovered, and there was the emigration from the European countries to Australia, who explored the continent of Australia and found it to be bowl-like. And the central Australia, as everyone knows, is full of desert, and there remain two natural calamities. One is the flood, other one is the storm, the wildfire. These are the natural calamities in Australia. And there is a tribe, original tribe called a Bush, and they have originally literature called Bush oral literature. And after the migration of the Europeans there and settled, Australian poetry began. So there is always poetry, the white Australian poetry and the bush poetry. So among them, the first one is the John Docker, who deploys in the study of the 1980s the distinctive Australian spirit which struck root and grew deep and strong in 1890s and slowed down its vital stream of went down underground. And Geoffrey Dutton, in his book on Australia, and it seems that the professor of English, he was invited to deliver a lecture on the inauguration of the Commonwealth Literature Fund, and he spoke about the D.H. Lawrence, kangaroos, and Australia as a setting against the plot narrative. Mr. Dutton himself was taken in by the majestic mainstream of English literature. He would have done well to take the coup from the author of the great tradition, that's F.R. Lewis, everyone knows. And the first very important poet is Sean Neilson, higher than the high priest of nature, and we can say he is Australia's Wordsworth, so to say. And in respect of the few chosen poems, that is for one known is so perverse as to claim Neilson is greater than Wordsworth in every poem of his. So like Wordsworth, he has written poems about flowers, stars, hills, and waterfalls, and natural beauty, and how a man is closely linked with nature, and also man and nature, and how he comes home to be more than the assertive faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. So Nelson, nature is not something, Neilson poetry, nature is not something to escape to, and rather it's the other way around. For if ever he goes to Stony Town and his girl will go with him, with a heat wave in her hair, the saint of the love of cinnamon, dust shaken out of her head, as velvet bird with quick step on her tongue. So there is another poet like Brennan, who is influenced by Walt Whitman, and there is also influence of Baudelaire and other French poets on some of the white African poets. And as you know, Judith Wright is another very important woman poet who wrote the poem "The Niggers Leap the New England." One regrets, though, see the facile conclusion in the last line of that poem. So distinguished a poet, eager as it were to effect a quick reconciliation. One wishes that at last had carried on its way to the genuine poet that she is, and she strikes different, that is salutary note in her another poem, Bora Ring. And the next important is A.D. Hope, and his the widely anthologized poem Death of the Bird. Everyone knows that, how he describes the death of the bird in its flight. The poet who had the genius and could not and would not feel lost merely because he has removed from the setting of English countryside and the context of the whole tradition of European life and thought. And he claims to be a great poet of modern Australia. And besides him, we have got other poets who are to be called like Will Larkins and Tom Guns. They are like Ted Hughes and all those counterparts of the British poets. And Brennan and Sean Nelson and Judith Wright, and another one is Alec Hope with passing reference to the vitality of the bush ballads. The Australian poets discussed here belong to an earlier generation and a generation that has distinguished practitioners like James McAuley. And there are other poems, other important poets since those times, like Vincent Buckley, Leigh Murray, Bruce Dawes, and Peter Potter. These are the recent important Australian poets. These poets have not poets not included here in some of the anthologies, but they have written fine poetry about Australia and its landscape, the culture, and what to say, the racial issues and language and all those things. And now I come to the poetry of New Zealand, which is very close to Australia, and it is called Last of the Lands. And most important of New Zealand's poets is Catherine Mansfield. Everyone knows her story, A Cup of Tea, is anthologized widely, and she has written poetry also. New Zealand poetry faced in the early years of this formative period precisely the same problems as other colonies of the British Empire. Imitativeness and derivativeness in the creative act no less than the reader's response. This was true of New Zealand's best known writer of Catherine Mansfield. And other less known woman writer is Miss Robin Hyde. And it seems to leave our country to realize while working on the sources of New Zealand's history, and she was a New Zealander, and she wrote fine poetry, though she left New Zealand in her early period. And next when we say the Alan Karnow. Alan Karnow is to be the father of New Zealand poetry, and he is the most important poet, and he is aware of the depressive, derivative and manneristic and spiritless words coming out of the New Zealand, and he only guided other poets to not to write bad poetry, and he asked them to write good poetry, warning them, you can't write literature, you can't paint art without experience. That's what he means to say. He contends that everyone is somebody and no one is anybody, and if universally anything, they are universally dull. And other poets along with Alan Karnow or James K. Baxter, Kendrick Smithson and C.K. Stead. And even Baxter bemoans has ceased to have contact with his base since The Fallen House. He published in 1953 volume. He much praised the Indian poems like Howrah Bridge Record, A Visit, Hardly a Departure. Of Smithson's verse, one speaks in the extended metaphor of a pilot. He is close to the ground where half the delight is in the fatality of any slip, but his flower flying into what? Both of the vision of this place and the poetic intensity, poetic instruments of the air age. Karnow is a very perceptive mind. With his perceptive mind, sees the problem in overwriting and verbiage in his poetry. One wonders if he is speaking of the Indian poetic scene or his own. Colonel Karnao himself brings together what he calls a reason's range and a green innocence of nerves, because he sees a kinship between the two in life, and therefore makes poetry out of such a harmonious union. And the best poem is Sailing or Drowning. It is a green myth which connects the past and present of the New Zealand, making evening and the morning star. New Zealand is seen by some as a landfall in unknown seas, but Karnao thinks, saying that simply by sailing in a new direction you could enlarge the world. Like many other poets of the Western tradition, Karnao believes the fall was fortunate, for only so can you remake the world. He writes in his Elegy on My Father that we must atone to the earth's Lord for the pride of all our voyages. So his poems are of a common inheritance of a common cause with all his possible and faithful memory, and he is careful though not to elevate the individual, identifying him with the society, linking the national past with his individual present. And nevertheless, Karnao's poems are rather more personal documents than what makes New Zealand poetry, which for an outsider it seems to affirm the truth of the ambivalent assumption, here is the world end where the wonders cease. For only Karnao, who has had a glimpse of the wonders, that can afford the luxury of such self-criticism of his own poetry, which encourages one to wait and watch the new efforts that come from New Zealand, or even from Maori writing has shown some promises what can come out of that country. And Maoris are the original tribes of New Zealand, and they have had their own oral literature, and they have their own poetry, and some recently there were good Maori poets. Thank you.